What an image, right? The scars of a fire on a forest and the contrast to new life. Perfect image for this element of transformation. It's what we all, at times in our life, are forced to deal with, that there are scars, but there's a potential of life, and that's something that's really important to us here at Cornerstone. Here's our desire behind this last element, the element of transformation, that each of us would have our own story of transformation, of growth, healing, and renewal, that we would have our own stories, that we would enjoy and share and get strength from the stories of those around us, and you're going to hear some great ones in a moment, but that we would all have our own stories, and not just stories in the past, but we would be living stories of transformation right now, that we'd never get to the place that we don't have the heart to keep going. And we never get to the place where we think that we've arrived and there's nothing more to do or areas to grow in. But transformation is this ongoing process that we say yes over and over again to God working in our lives to bring about growth, healing, and renewal. Here at Cornerstone, this is our definition of transformation. It is positioning ourselves to become whole, healthy followers of Jesus. It is about following him, but it's about us putting ourselves in a position that allows God to work in our lives. We chose the words to that definition carefully because we want there to be a tension between the things that we're able to do in the process and the things that we're not able to do. There are certain things that we can do to facilitate our growth, but there are certain things we can't do, that we have to rely on God. It's like a sailor who relies on the wind to sail his ship. Even though he's completely dependent on it, he's in this strange place of not being able to manufacture it or create it. But a sailor positions the boat and he gets his ship ready and the sails ready so that the wind begins to blow. It can blow him in the direction that he wants to go. He's ready for it. He knows what to do with it, and he's always waiting for it. See, that's the idea behind transformation, is that we would position ourselves in a certain way that allow God to work in our lives, but we would know that there are certain things that only God can do. And this helps us because it reminds us that we can't grow, we can't change, we can't heal on our own, but we need help. And so one of the basic principles of transformation. The goal of transformation, it can be summed up in these ways. I have a few different kind of ways to describe the goal of transformation. It's following well, it's to be like him, but here are some that people enjoy that are helpful. It's to become the person that God created you to be. It's fulfilling the potential that he created inside each one of us. We all are unique people with gifts and strengths, and God has an image of who he wants us to be. And as we say yes to this element in transformation, God is moving us more and more towards the person that he created. So we're not becoming less of ourselves by changing, we're becoming more of ourselves. And so although it's difficult, it feels natural. And eventually we see how much it fits us. So becoming who God created us to be. Here's my favorite one. It's what's helpful to me, at least right now. That God might have all of us is the goal of transformation. Not just part of me. Not just the past, not just the present, but also the future. Not just certain parts of my heart. Not just certain relationships. Not just certain times during the day, but all of me. There's plenty of room to grow in that. That God might have all of me. That God might have all of us. Think of it this way. Transformation, the goal of it is that we might have all of God. And it's not a matter of God deciding to give us all that he has, but a lot of times we live so disconnected and distracted that we can't even draw from him his presence that he gives us on a daily basis. And so growth would be to draw from God. Transformation can also be summed up this way if you use emotionally healthy language, that we would grow in our ability to receive and give love, not just from God, but from other people. And let's face it, we struggle with this, receiving love from God. And we want to love him with our whole heart. And so this is part of growth, is loving him. But we also struggle with loving people. We struggle with loving the people we love the most. So we need him. We need his help. And so transformation is practical. It is about love. It's about loving him, receiving his love, and giving it to other people. Now, all of these platitudes can be helpful to us at certain times. But this element is not convenient. It is an intentional element of saying, God, have your way in my life. Help these things come about. And it usually requires some pain. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8 is one of our foundational verses for this element. Paul is writing to Timothy, one of his, he calls him like a spiritual son. He loves him like a son. And he tells him that gives him kind of direction for his life and continuing to grow. And at this point, Timothy is a mature young man. And he's already making some good choices, but Paul is pushing him to go further. And he says in verse 7, have nothing to do with godless myths or old wives' tales. A few months ago, we looked at this passage. What that means is don't rely on the wisdom of your age or your place. And right now, the wisdom of our age when it comes to thinking of our struggles and the darkness that we all have in our lives or around us, or the darkness even in our own character, the wisdom of the age says to ignore those things or to manage them away and say that they're not that big of a deal. Or the wisdom of our age would say, it's just something that you need to try a little harder on, and you're able to deal with your own darkness on your own. Those are all godless myths, things that are not true. So Paul goes on to say, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Train yourself to be godly. It's the tension of moving in a certain direction and allowing God to work. To go a little further with this element, we need to know that it is difficult, because to be a part of God's transformation in our own life, we have to look at the things we don't like to look at in our lives. We have to do the hard work. We have to do things that are difficult, like looking at our past wounds. We've been hurt. I'll tell you a story in a moment of a study that just kind of is evidence of how hurt people are. But we're hurt, and it's not fun. It's not fun to look back on your past wounds and to think, those things actually affect me today. And it's not fun to look at our own lives and look at the sin that's in our life. We all struggle with sin. We don't even live up to our own standards of how we want people to love us. See, it's true of all of us. We struggle with sin. And so we have to look at our sin, and we have to look at our dysfunctional behavior and our dysfunctional thoughts and our reactions and say, you know what, I'm not just going to settle for the status quo, but I want God to do something in my life. But to do that, it is difficult to look at those difficult things. But we must. Because when we do not deal with our darkness, either things we experience because of bad choices of someone else or even our own negative choices, they wreak havoc in our life. Darkness doesn't go away on its own. Healing does not occur on its own. We don't just get better. We don't just make better choices. We need some help, and it can't be ignored. And unfortunately, this element is ignored all the time by people today. And what it does is pain leads to pain. Wounded people wound people. So this is an element that has to do with those in our lives that we're close with. As we grow and change and heal and experience renewal, we can bring that to other people. We love it here at Cornerstone when out in the real world, something is brought up that proves what God has to say is real. Not that we need the world proving it, but it's nice when it happens. And so God's been talking about throughout the scriptures for a very long time how important it is that we would grow and change and that we never stop doing this. And if we don't, there are consequences to that in just natural life. Well, I was recently turned on to a study that was done in the 1990s. It was in combination between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. And in the survey, they surveyed 17,500 adults. And what they were trying to find out is if there is a correlation between difficult childhood experiences and health outcomes as adults. So, is there a reason that you have negative health outcomes? And could that reason be that you had these difficult experiences as children? Well, the study was kind of groundbreaking because we've known for a long time that adverse childhood experiences can affect us emotionally and spiritually and mentally, but we didn't know that it necessarily affects us physically. But what they found out is that it does. They found out that nearly 70% of the people they surveyed had something called an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. And this is how they define ACE. I'll use their definitions. An adverse childhood experience is emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. It's emotional or physical neglect. It's parental separation or divorce. It's parental incarceration. It's domestic violence. It's parental mental illness or parental substance abuse. And so if you think about that, most of us in the room could raise our hand and say, yeah, I've actually experienced one of those ACEs. The study showed that 7 out of 10 people do. The study also found that 12% of people have at least 4 ACEs or more. Now here's what was alarming. The higher the ACE score, the lower the health outcomes. The higher the ACE score, the more likely someone to experience heart disease, versions of cancer, depression, of course, at-risk behavior as a result, but that's because of things that had happened. So in a sense, you say, oh my goodness. What we see is that wounds and pain and darkness continue to show up in our lives and our physical lives. Now here's the good news. God is bigger than all of those things. And his renewal and his healing has dominion over brokenness and over ACEs and over-emotional wounds. And so when we read scriptures like Romans chapter 5, verses 20 and 21, where sin abounds or increases, grace abounds or increases, we know that that means God forgives when we sin, but we also know that the effects of sin on our life, as they increase, grace increases. God has the medicine to transform wounds and darkness and struggle. It's good news. It's not a death sentence, that God is there. And so what it does is, as we think back in our life, we deal with our wounds, our dysfunctional behavior, we simply say, you know, these are opportunities for God to work. They found that these ACEs they affected a child's brain, and it showed up in their executive functions and their ability to make good decisions and, things that had to do with pleasure and good decision making. And their brains were changed. Well, then you think of Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but what? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. God's big enough to do that, to transform the way we think and we process and we deal with things. And then you think of Isaiah 53, one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, because it talks about the effects of the gospel, the death of Jesus and his resurrection. And it doesn't just say that Jesus hung on a cross to forgive us, but it says he hung on a cross to heal us. Heal us from what? Well, it talks about sin, our bad choices, our corrupted character. But you know what else it talks about? Our infirmities, our broken bodies. It talks about our sorrows, that he carries our sorrows. He handles it all. And so when it says, by his wounds we are healed, we have great news. It's the good news. It's the promises of transformation. We move forward with God in those things. And then here's what is really just fabulous. The difficult things that happen to us or that we deal with, they don't come from God. Scriptures tell us that God is not the source of evil, okay? We know that he watches it happen, and we have questions why he allows things to happen, but evil does not come from God. In a sense, God is not the storm, but God is always in the storm, and he's with us. And Romans 8:28 says that God takes all things and works them for good for those that love him, who are called according to his purpose. What that means is he can take the crappiest stories, the worst life, the worst habits, addictions, pain, wounds, whatever it is. He can actually use those things, take them, redeem them, and turn them around for good. Good for you and good for others. And it's great news. These are the promises of transformation. We all need to be living our own stories of God working in our lives. We need reminded, though, when we talk about transformation, that there are different skills that are needed. Usually when we think about getting better at something, we think of using skills like educating ourselves, reading some more. Let's find the perfect book, the self-help book that will help me get better. Or we try harder. Say, I'll never do that again, and I'm going to try really, really hard. And we get confident in ourselves for a while, and we use whatever power we have, and we rely on our own independence to change. These skills, though, do not work when it comes to transformation. We need a whole other tool belt that includes patience and humility and submission and honesty and vulnerability and relying on community and courage. See, we need different skills, and so we need to learn a new way. And so here at Cornerstone, we love talking about transformation and saying yes to these new skills so that we might position ourselves in such a way that when the wind begins to blow, God works in our life. And we all want our own stories. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot more about how change happens because we want to encourage you, if you need some more help, to go to the last series that we did. It's this 12-week study on change, and we can't really do it all in one message, but I want to remind you of what we covered in the Metamorphosis series, living a life of change. We went through 12 steps that are helpful, all biblical principles that help a person change, but there's really 4 movements within those 12 steps that we shared. The first movement is the movement of awareness. Beginning of any process of change is to be aware that we have problems, we struggle, we have wounds, that there are issues, you could say, in our lives. To be aware of those things, but not just aware of our own struggles and the things that we have, but aware that God is with us, that God does not leave us on his own, but God is with us and he wants to help us, but the help comes from surrendering our plans and submitting to his. So it's a difficult step, but being aware is the start. The second movement is the movement of healing, that as we begin to work on certain things in our life, God actually takes us to the very source of our pain, the very source of our dysfunction, the very source of our sin. And usually he takes us all the way to a wound. And there at the wound, we see what happened. And we understand God shows us why we do what we do. And we understand why we believe lies about ourselves and about other people. And there in the wound, we emerge from it, and God replaces the lies with truth. And he replaces it with love and affection. And so we come from the wound and we experience healing. The third movement are really the actions that we take. They're the steps that we take to continue to grow. And so these are actions. So we exercise forgiveness. And we make a skillful amends, which means we go to others and ask for forgiveness. And then we persevere, because one thing that's common for people who try to change and experience transformation is that we all get discouraged sometimes because we step back. We'll mess up again in the same area. We might mess up over and over again. And we have to get past the thoughts in our mind, I'm a failure, or this is pointless, and get through that and believe that God is with us and we persevere, that he'll finish the story. And so perseverance, forgiveness, amends are the steps that we take. And then lastly, there's a rhythm that leads to health in our life. The step we described was rule of life, but really it's the idea of spending time with God, allowing God to speak to you and to influence you. It's learning to hear his voice. And so we grow in our practices of prayer, not just once a day, but throughout the day. And we learn to read the scriptures to hear God's voice. These are things that lead to continued health. And then lastly, we serve. And we thought this was important enough, we turned it into 2 steps. As we serve others, we're able to express our gratitude for what God has done for us as we serve others. And then what's really, really special is that God begins to show us our own calling, the sweet spot that a lot of times emerges from our wounds. So examples of this would be a former alcoholic becoming an AA sponsor. His calling came from his wound or her wound. Or say someone that struggled as an adolescent with insecurity and went through difficult times. They become a mentor or a youth leader for students at the same age. A calling made perfect for them. And so we learn to serve. These are the steps that lead to change. And so you can watch these. We'd love to talk to you about them. But our desire is that we'd all have our own story. And so I want you to hear from some people that do have their own story. Tara and Martha, come on up. Sam and Aaron. I want you to hear some great stories, some unique stories of recent transformation that's taken place among people in our community. So there you go, buddy. Good to see you.
As Brian said, one of the things we want to do is not just talk about transformation, but stories, and hear the stories of individuals that have experienced transformation in the last 6 months or so. And so we asked them the question, we asked Tara and Martha and Sam the question of where are you working on and experiencing transformation? So Tara, would you share?
Can we trade stools? Because I could use that stool and you could use, no, I'm kidding. Anyway, way back during the first message of the Metamorphosis series, Jean asked us to think about one challenge that we wanted to overcome in our lives, like one area of transformation. So I closed my eyes, prayed real quietly, and I knew what it was for me. It was being judgmental. Now I said to myself, Tara, you are definitely judgmental. Not all the time, but you are definitely judgmental. Now, I want to give my definition of judgmental first. It is making value judgments about other people's decisions or actions or their behaviors and even their thoughts according to what I think is right or according to my life experiences. Now, judging is different than evaluating. I'm going to quote John Sandford, one of my favorite authors, he wrote The Kingdom Within, and he said, anyone who seeks to make a friend who must employ someone else or work for someone else, or who is doing business with others, must evaluate other people. But judgment is different. When we judge someone, we have assumed a godlike role, because in judging, we claim to know the meaning and moral consequence of another person's life. Now, why am I like this, I say to myself? Well, I came from Brooklyn. It was tough in the 60s and 70s, I got to be honest, but that probably wasn't the only reason. I can't blame Brooklyn. It's probably part of my personality or some sort of a combination of both. When I thought about conquering, I got a little discouraged that I couldn't conquer this part of my life. After all, according to statisticbrain.com, only 8% of people, 8% who make New Year's resolutions are successful. It is really hard to change something about yourself. It's really hard. So now I'm going to tell you my story. Time passed, a few months, and then this past March, I decided to go to Israel to attend the wedding of my daughter's boyfriend's brother, who was getting married there. And while I was planning, I was like, oh, well, let's see, what do I want to do? Who do I want to see? Old friends. My husband said to me, who are you compelled to see? And I was like, compelled? You know, in the back of my mind lately, I thought about this roommate from 30 years ago who I lived with when we were in our 20s. And since then, she had moved to Israel, and she was on my mind. And I had a feeling, just kind of swirling around down there, back there in my brain, that I wasn't the nicest to her. Let's put it that way. I did something to her, something judgmental probably, but I just couldn't remember what it was that I did or I said. But I do remember one thing. At that time, I knew she never measured up to what my idea of what a believer was. I mean, to me, she didn't read her Bible enough. She didn't pray enough. She didn't go to enough services. And I definitely did not like her boyfriend. Yeah. Just saying. So all those things are outer things, like going to services, you know, going here, going there. But that was me at the time. That was what I thought spiritual was. So I don't know exactly how I treated her. I couldn't remember. But I just had a feeling it wasn't good. So I contacted her a few weeks before I was going to go to Israel. And we set up a time, and we were going to hike at the Sea of Galilee. And I started out the hike by actually telling her that I apologized for everything that I did to her 30 years ago, not knowing what it was, of course. I wasn't specific because I couldn't remember. And then she told me something really interesting. She said, you know, Tara, when you contacted me 2 weeks ago, my husband said to me, why do you think Tara wants to see you? And she said, I think she wants to apologize. And I was like, okay. I just realized that 2 weeks ago. She's probably been thinking about it for 30 years. And what in the world did I do 30 years ago that she remembered? Those were the two things I was thinking. And as we hiked, she told me every single thing. We had hours. Now, I'm not going to tell you, so don't get excited. So she told me in detail every single thing. And it was actually difficult, actually almost sickening, to hear how judgmental I was to her at that time. It's never easy to hear something like that about yourself. And as she was telling me the details, I knew that it was true. But that's what I was like back then. I have to be honest with myself. I categorized people, and I pressured them to fit into whatever category, whatever, box I thought was appropriate for them. So when she finished, I really apologized deeply from my heart because I knew what I had done. And she had so much relief that I, embraced her, and she knew that I totally, accepted her for who she is. That's not even the right word. I would say that I truly loved her for who she is, and she loved me back. It was such a deep love, and it was so beautiful. She forgave me, and there was great reconciliation. Now, that experience was a really big step for me because half the battle with a problem, I think, is first of all realizing that you have the problem and admitting you have the problem. And to me, that's what transformation is about. It's a slow process. It's usually a painful process, but it's a work in progress. But I'll tell you what, it is really fun not judging people. I'm having a great time. There are so many fun, wonderful people out there. That's what I'm finding. And you know what? You never know what someone is like until you hear their story. So I want to end today by saying that I'm very thankful and appreciative to this community for the help that I received along the way, the messages that have had such a big impact and a huge help in my life in the transformation process, the spiritual direction that I received. And I especially want to thank my family and friends. You know who you are, because instead of judging me, when you see me fall back into the old patterns, you gently prod me on, honestly, gently, towards continuing on the good path, and you cheer me on.
Thank you so much, Tara. I love the way that your transformation led to your friend's transformation, too. That's beautiful. Martha.
I guess it was last February, there was a class that was going to be held here at the church called a healing prayer class. And one of the things they asked us to do was find a picture or something in nature that symbolized where our heart was. And it was one of those days where, in February, when, there'd just been a big old huge dump of a snowstorm. And I looked out on my porch, and I'm not the kind of person that pulls all the dead flowers out of the plants until the very next spring when I'm getting ready to plant them, and I still hadn't done it yet. But I looked out and I saw this dead plant with just this glop of snow on it. And I thought, that's the way my heart feels. My heart feels dead, feels cold, feels hard. And I began to ask questions why. And going to this class, it was a 12 or 13-week commitment. And I thought, I want to address this. I know that part of it is residual grief from losing my husband 7 years ago. But I had sensed a growing coldness and deadness in my heart to the Lord. And that really bothered me because I love Jesus. He loves me. I knew these things in my head, but there was this distance and this coldness there that I couldn't seem to get past. And so I needed help. And I remembered Chris, I think his name was the guy that spoke in the last series, and he talked about how he admitted that he had an issue with alcoholism, but he could never submit to getting help. And I thought, I need help. I want help. And so his talk that day helped spur me on to get additional help for myself. And so as I started this class, there were just a number of things I felt like. There were life circumstances as well as losing my husband that had just caused my heart to hurt and be distant. I realized I had become distant with some of my friends. I thought, what if God takes one of them or two of them or five of them, And I was really fearful of being close to some of the people I'd been close to for a long time. And I felt like I wanted to address that. And so one of the practices that they encouraged us to have in this class was to find just a sacred space in our minds, or an actual literal sacred space. I mean, it could be on a park at a bench, or one of my favorite places is overlooking Boulder in Louisville. There's a bench there that looks over the whole city of Boulder. And I have pictured that, just myself sitting there and just having conversations with the Lord. But that became more real. I began to do that more often, and I would tell him, I'm really ticked that you took my husband. He was a really good guy. He really loved me. He loved our children. He loved many of you. I'm really ticked. And I didn't sense scolding. I just sensed him embracing me and loving me in all of that. And I would even picture Jesus just putting his arms around me and stroking my hair and saying, it's okay, I love you. You can tell me anything. And so I felt more free to begin to communicate with him. And sometimes he would give me a verse that was a familiar verse that I'd had. Sometimes I felt like he would just say, I love you. You're okay. You're going to make it. I'm not going to turn my back on you. And so through all that process, I began to go to a few of my friends that I felt like I had become distant with because of fear. And I saw God repair some friendships that I had begun to let suffer. And another thing that happened that was a real surprise was typically at the end of the year in the spring, when the women's ministry kind of wraps up, I'm just exhausted. I feel like, oh my goodness, thank goodness that's over. Even though I love it all year long, at the end I'm typically really exhausted. And there was a shift this year, and I didn't quite understand it. And I began to go, wow, what are we going to do this summer? And what are we going to do next year? And I had this enthusiasm and this joy that I hadn't experienced in a long time. And I really felt like that was just Jesus saying, I'm going to take away the stuff that's really hard in your heart, and I'm going to give you new life and new hope and new energy even. And I remember back early in the year thinking, well, I'm going to turn 65 in June. Am I supposed to retire, or do I stay on, or what do I do? And so I've just been praying about that all year. And to get to the end of the year and feel more energy than when I started, I thought, I don't think I'm ready to retire. I'm in this for a while, you know? So that was just an encouraging sign to me that he wasn't done with me yet, and that I had lots of life to give. So thanks.